The signal lasted 11 seconds. Sergeant Mara Voss heard it through a cracked helmet speaker in the ruins of what had once been a relay tower on Keth 7, and she almost didn't recognize it for what it was. It wasn't a distress beacon. It wasn't military code. It was a piece of music. 22 bars of something old, strings and brass, and the low, patient roll of a timpani drum, and then static, and then nothing. She pulled off her helmet and stood there in the cold, with ice crystals forming on her lashes, and listened to the static, like it might say something. It did not. "Play it back," she said. Her comms tech, specialist Dav Orua, was 17 years old and had never seen Earth. He was also, she had long since decided, the best radio operator alive in this quadrant of occupied space. He played it back. She listened to it again. 22 bars, strings, brass timpani. "What is that?" she asked. Dav didn't answer for a moment. Then, "I think it's from a movie." They were 53 days into the Yivari occupation of the inner colonies. The Yivari had arrived without negotiation, without ultimatum, without any of the courtesies that human beings extended to each other before they started killing. They simply came out of the dark between stars and began, systematically, to dismantle what had taken humanity 400 years to build. They were methodical, patient. They had the cool efficiency of a species that had done this before to others and expected no surprises. The surprises had started on day 9. Not military surprises, not the kind the Yivari would have recognized as a threat. It began with a signal picked up by Sir Shepard's radio tower on the agricultural moon of Tannic. 12 minutes of old Earth video, broadcast on a civilian frequency, depicting a group of people in cardboard costumes reenacting a scene from a film that had been made 700 years ago. The sound design was done with kitchen pots. Someone had used a Yorkshire Terrier in a knit vest to play a smuggler. The Yivari had intercepted it, analyzed it, logged it as noise, and moved on. 3 days later, another one, different moon, different hands. The same film, different scene rendered in puppet theatre by a family of 4 in a basement on what was left of New Brisbane. Their Darth Vader was a sock puppet with felt teeth. Their spaceship battle was paper plates on fishing wire. The child playing the princess was maybe 8 years old and delivered her lines with the kind of flat sincerity that only children can manage, the absolute commitment of someone who has not yet learned to be embarrassed by feeling things. The Yivari analyzed it, logged it as noise, moved on. Mara sat with her back against a wall of frozen rubble and thought about the signal. Dav was still running frequencies, his face pale blue in the glow of his equipment. "Same film as the others?" she asked. "Same film. Scene 47. The one in the ice cave." He looked up. "Sergeant, there have been 43 of these signals in the last 3 weeks, all civilian bands, all different planets, all the same movie." "Why?" He shook his head. "I don't know. But they're not stopping. Someone out there, a lot of someones. They keep making them. New ones every day." She thought about that. She had grown up on a colony world that had bad weather and no cinema, and a grandmother who had told her stories instead. Her grandmother had told her about the old films, the ones from before the diaspora, from the blue-green world that most of her generation had never seen and never would. She had said, "The thing about those old stories is that people never stop telling them. They tell them with whatever they have. They tell them with sock puppets. They tell them with their kids. They tell them in the dark when everything is burning." Mara stood up and put her helmet back on. "Send a response," she said. "Same frequency, whatever you can manage." Dav stared at her. "Sergeant, if we broadcast, the Yivari will. They'll log it as noise." She picked up her rifle. "Send the response." What Dav sent, because he was 17 and had grown up watching everything humanity had ever archived, was the first 8 bars of the piece that opened the movie. Just the music. No voice, no coordinates, no military code that the Yivari might eventually learn to pass. Just, "We're here. We heard you. We're still here." The answer came back in 4 hours. Not from one source, from 9. By the end of that week, Mara's team had catalogued over 200 signals. They were not coordinating. They were not a resistance cell. not in any sense the Yivari's tactical models would have recognized. They were farmers and teachers and the employees of companies that no longer existed, broadcasting from cellars and field shelters and the cargo holds of ships that had nowhere to go. They were recreating by hand, in whatever medium they had available, an old story about an empire and the ragged few who wouldn't kneel to it. A university lecturer on Seth Minor had used her department's remaining 3D printer to produce articulated figures and was acting out the scenes in careful stop motion, uploading them in 17-second bursts. An elderly man on the third moon of Calyx used watercolor paintings held up to a camera, one by one, narrating in a voice that shook with age and something else, something harder. Children on a dozen worlds, children who had lived their whole short lives under Yivari sky, were building the starships out of cardboard and tape and holding them on string in front of painted backdrops and speaking lines that were 7 centuries old. The Yivari, to their credit, did eventually notice. It took them 31 days. What they could not determine was why. Commander Velserath of the Occupational Consolidation Fleet was not a being prone to uncertainty. The Yivari operated on a principle of total informational efficiency. Every datum had a purpose. Every signal had a source. Every behavior had a cause that could be isolated and neutralized. It was why they had won 43 planetary occupations across 6 centuries without losing one. The human signals confounded the principle. They were not distress calls. They were not coded military communication. Velsarath's cryptographers had run every known human cipher against the transmissions and found nothing. They were, insofar as the Xenoanalysis Division could determine, simply recreations. Humans, under occupation with limited resources and significant personal risk, were spending their time and energy making low-quality dramatizations of a very old entertainment product. The Analysis Division's best guess was that it was ritual mourning behavior. Humans, when distressed, revisited symbols of cultural identity. This was logged, categorized, and filed under psychological vulnerability patterns. What it was not filed under was threat. Velsarath made one mistake. It was the same mistake the Empire in the movie made, and it was the same mistake every empire makes when it looks at people with nothing but stories and calls them harmless. It ignored them. Mara found the boy on the 48th day. He was maybe 12, living in the crawl space of a collapsed community center on a world called Iris, which the Yivari had swept and declared pacified. He had a handheld camera with a cracked screen, a battery pack he'd salvaged from a medical unit, and a collection of handmade props that he'd been building for what looked like weeks. He had constructed, from bent wire and painted foam, a recognizable replica of the villain's breathing apparatus. He had a flashlight with a red gel over the lens for a lightsaber. He had a hand puppet that he'd labeled in careful marker letters, Obi-Wan. He was in the middle of filming when she found him. She watched him for a moment, through the gap in the rubble, before she announced herself. He was holding his makeshift villain mask in one hand and the puppet in the other, and speaking both parts with absolute focus, delivering lines that he clearly had memorized so thoroughly they'd become native to him, and his voice didn't waver. 12 years old in a crawl space in a pacified zone, and his voice didn't waver. She announced herself. He didn't run. He looked at her, took the uniform, the rank, the rifle, and then he looked back at his props and said, with the particular dignity of a child who has decided not to be afraid, "I'm almost done with this scene." She sat down in the rubble and waited. He finished the scene. It was the one in the film's third act, the revelation, the moment the villain tells the hero who his father is. The boy played both parts. His villain was slow and grave and wrong in a way that was somehow exactly right. His hero started out defiant and ended up, not broken, not quite, just still, just holding on. When he was done, he lowered the props and looked at her. "Who's going to see it?" she asked. "Everyone who picks up the signal," he said. "How many people is that?" He shrugged with the precision of someone who has thought about this and accepted the answer. "I don't know. Enough." She thought about her grandmother's voice in the dark. She thought about 22 bars of strings and brass. "What's your name?" she said. "Theo. Theo. I'm Mara." She looked at the camera in his hands, the cracked screen, the blinking battery indicator showing maybe 40 minutes of charge left. "I think," she said carefully, "that what you're doing might be more important than you know." He looked at her with the expression of someone who has already figured this out but is politely waiting for the adult to catch up. "They don't know what to do with it, the Yivari. They keep analyzing our signals and they can't figure out what they mean. My mom explained it. She used to study them, the Yivari. She said they don't understand things that don't have a tactical function." He paused. "Stories don't have a tactical function." "No," Mara agreed. "They don't, so the Yivari can't read them. They just see noise." He said it with a child's clarity, the kind that comes before the mind learns to complicate things. "But we can read them. Every single one of us can read them. We know what they mean. Here is what the signals meant, though no one sent a message saying so, because no message was needed. We are here. We are still making things with our hands. We are still telling the story about the ones who wouldn't surrender to the Empire. We are holding handmade props in crawl spaces on occupied worlds and speaking 700-year-old words into cracked cameras, and we are not stopping. We are not stopping because stopping would mean something that we are not prepared to mean, and so we are making sock puppet Darth Vaders and paper plate Star Destroyers and 8-year-olds in cardboard armor who deliver their lines with perfect sincerity. And we are broadcasting it on civilian frequencies that the Yivari cannot read as anything but noise, and in the noise we are telling each other, I'm here, I'm here, I'm here, I'm still here." The Yivari could not read it because they had never had to be defeated in order to survive. They had never been a species that lost things and kept going. Every war they had fought, they had won. Every people they had occupied, they had broken within the first 6 months. The literature of the Yivari contained no epics of loss, no songs about last stands, no stories about what you hold on to when everything else is gone. They had no framework for why a 12-year-old boy would spend his battery charge on a camera filming a scene from an ancient movie when he could have spent it on a distress beacon. They did not understand that the camera was the distress beacon, and the response, and the community, and the proof of life. On day 61, Mara made contact with a resistance coordinator 3 systems over. She had found him the way she found most things now, through the signals. He had been broadcasting the film's opening crawl. Just the text, scrolling white letters on a black screen, read aloud by a voice that had clearly once belonged to someone who recorded professional audio. Every 3rd day, on the same frequency. For 6 weeks, she had triangulated his signal not by military means, but by the patterns of who responded to it. Where the clusters of answering signals were thickest, the safe zones were. His name was Adjutant Cassell. He had been a supply chain logistics officer before the occupation, which meant he was extremely good at moving things quietly and was deeply unimpressed by the Yivari's predictive models. "They're running pattern analysis on the signals," he told her over encrypted channel. "Looking for military coordination. They haven't found any because there isn't any. Hundreds of civilian groups, none of them talking to each other, all broadcasting independently." He paused. "They're calling it cultural noise contamination. They've deprioritized monitoring it." "Good," Mara said. "It's better than good, Sergeant. They've pulled 3 interceptor squadrons off civilian band monitoring to focus on encrypted military traffic, which means there's a hole in their coverage net big enough to move through." She thought of Theo in his crawl space. She thought of the family with the sock puppets. She thought of the university lecturer and her 3D printed figures and the old man with the watercolors. "Can you move supplies through civilian band coordination?" she asked. "If we route the timing through the broadcast schedule," Cassell said slowly. "If we treat the signals as a clock rather than a message. If everyone knows the story well enough to know which scene comes next and what that timing means." He stopped. She could hear him thinking. "They can't read it," he said, "because it's not code. It's a story, and you either know the story or you don't. And every human out there, Mara said, knows the story. The operation ran for 19 days. They moved medical supplies on the broadcast of Scene 14, weapons components on Scene 31, personnel on Scenes 44, 45, and 47. The revelation scenes, the ones that ran long. Timing keys were embedded in the specific props people chose to use, the camera angles, the number of takes. None of it would ever look like military coordination to a species that had no reference for the source material. None of it was code, technically. It was devotion. It was the specific shared knowledge of people who had grown up watching the same thing and loved it and memorized it so thoroughly it had become part of how they thought. The Yivari never broke it. There was nothing to break. You cannot decrypt something that operates in the register of love. The night the final supply run cleared the Yivari perimeter, Mara sat in a shelter on the edge of what had been a city and watched Theo's latest upload on a salvaged screen. He'd gotten better. The props were still handmade, still clearly the work of a child with wire and foam, but the lighting had improved. He'd figured out how to use a piece of foil as a reflector, and his performances had developed a quality that was hard to name. Presence, maybe. The specific authority of someone who has done something enough times that they've stopped thinking about doing it and started simply being it. He was in the middle of the scene where the heroes escape the ice planet. His ships were paper plates, his explosions were crumpled red and orange tissue paper. His pilot characters were drawn on cardboard and moved by hand, slightly stilted, completely real. She watched it to the end. Then she played it back. On day 79, the first Yivari garrison on Iris reported anomalies in civil population behavior. Specifically, organized gatherings at predictable intervals, in defiance of curfew protocols, for the purpose of what appeared to be communal viewing of entertainment broadcasts. The garrison commander requested guidance on whether to classify this as civil unrest. Fleet Command reviewed the broadcasts, confirmed entertainment, cultural ritual, psychologically consistent with occupation stress behavior document in 37 prior subjugation campaigns, not threat, log and monitor, deprioritize. By the time the garrison on Iris understood what it had missed, by the time any of the Yivari understood what had moved underneath the noise, the supply lines had been running for 3 weeks. 12 resistance cells that had had no contact with each other were now, effectively, a network. Not because anyone had built a network, because everyone had watched the same movie. The Yivari's after-action analysis, later, would spend considerable processing on the question of how an occupied population had coordinated resistance through entertainment media. The analysis concluded that the humans had exploited a cultural signal blind spot in Yivari monitoring protocols. What it did not conclude, what the Yivari did not have the framework to conclude, was the more fundamental thing, that humans, when they are afraid and losing and pressed into crawl spaces, do not stop making things. They make things with whatever they have. They make things with sock puppets. They make things with their children, with their dying batteries, with crumpled tissue paper, and foil reflectors and pieces of wire bent into the shapes of the ships they remember. They make things because making things is the evidence of a self that hasn't been extinguished. It is the specific human proof of life, and they share those things with each other, across dark space on civilian frequencies. And they know what the sharing means even without a message because they share the story. They have always shared the story. It is 700 years old, and it is also happening now, right now, in every shelter and crawl space and cargo hold, where someone's holding a cardboard prop and speaking old words into a cracked camera, meaning, I'm still here. You're not alone. We know how this story goes. Theo's last upload before the Iris cell went active was the final scene. He had built a set. Not a good set, pieces of cardboard and foil, and one strip of red LED lighting he'd salvaged from somewhere, arranged carefully to suggest a place of ceremony, of gathering. He had a whole cast of handmade figures, articulated, positioned with obvious care. He played the human characters himself, voice only. the camera staying on his figures so you could believe for a moment you were watching something large. The scene he chose was the one at the end. The gathering, the medals, the room full of people who had won something and also lost something, and were standing together in the light anyway. He played it straight. No irony, no winking at the camera, no acknowledgement that he was a crawlspace with wire figures. Just the scene, just the words. His Leia was a bent wire figure with a painted face. His Chewbacca was a piece of fur fabric over a bottle. His hero stood on a cardboard platform and received something from someone else's hands, and the music swelled. He'd rigged a tiny speaker with his last good cable, and it was not a good film. It was not a polished film. It was a 12-year-old's handmade love letter to a 700-year-old story, broadcast on a civilian frequency from a pacified zone on an occupied world. Mara watched it in a shelter with 7 other people, their faces lit by a salvaged screen, and no one said anything for a long time after it ended. Then someone in the back of the room said quietly, "Scene 49 tomorrow." Scene 49 was the coordinates. The operation began at dawn.